It seemed normal enough, just your average carnival with rides, games, food stalls, and a bunch of loud music blasting from the speakers. We were walking around trying to decide what to do next after downing some greasy burgers. There was this weird tension in the air though, like something was a little off. The carnival wasn't as crowded as you'd expect for a Saturday night, but we didn't think much of it. After all, it was getting late and maybe people had just gone home. Anyway, we decided to split up for a bit. I wanted to check out some of the smaller rides while my friends wanted to try out a few of the rigged games. So, I wandered off on my own, just strolling through the different sections of the carnival. That's when I saw it, this old run-down looking alleyway off to the side. The whole carnival was lit up with bright colors and lights, but this part was dimly lit, like no one wanted to go near it. Curiosity got the better of me, so I walked down the alley. It was weird. The further I went, the quieter it got. I could still hear the music and noise from the main part of the carnival, but it felt distant, like I was walking into a different world or something. At the end of the alley was this small faded tent with a sign above it that read, "The Final Ride." Now, I'm not usually one to get freaked out by stuff like this. It looked old, sure, but that was part of the charm, right? It had this retro vibe, like something out of a 1950s carnival. There was an old carny guy standing at the entrance, wearing a stained vest and a tattered hat. His face was pale, with these sunken eyes that seemed to be looking right through me. He didn't say anything at first, just kind of waved me over. I stood there for a second, debating whether I should go in or just head back to find my friends. But before I could decide, the carny spoke up. "Care for a ride?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. Something about the way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I figured it was all part of the act. It's a carnival after all. They're supposed to be a little creepy, right? So I shrugged and said, "Sure, why not?" The guy gave me this weird smile, showing his yellow teeth, and motioned for me to step inside the tent. I walked in and immediately noticed how dark it was. The only light came from a few flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. In the middle of the tent was a small ride, one of those old-fashioned roller coasters, the kind that just goes in circles. It was rusty and rickety, like it hadn't been maintained in years. There was only one other person in the ride, this guy sitting in one of the seats. He was wearing a suit, but it looked all wrong, like it didn't fit him properly. His arms were stiff at his sides and his head was tilted at a strange angle, like he couldn't hold it up straight. I figured he was just another carny, part of the show to make the ride seem creepier. The carny guy led me over to the ride and motioned for me to sit down next to the stiff man. I hesitated for a second, but I didn't want to look like a coward, so I sat down. As soon as I did, the carny guy pulled a lever and the ride started moving. Slowly at first, just a gentle spin, but then it began to pick up speed. At first, it seemed like any other carnival ride, you know, spinning around in circles, the wind in your face, that kind of thing. But then the lights went out. I couldn't see a thing. The ride kept getting faster and faster, and I could feel this weird pressure in my ears, like we were going down, deep underground or something. I called out, "Hey, what's going on? Is this part of the ride?" No answer. I reached out to the guy sitting next to me, hoping he'd give me some clue, but his body felt cold, like ice. I yanked my hand back, my heart racing. The ride was going so fast now that I could barely keep my balance, even though I was strapped in. The whole thing felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be happening. Suddenly, the ride came to a screeching halt, throwing me forward in my seat. The lights flickered back on, and I realized we were in the same tent where we'd started. The carny guy was standing by the lever, grinning that creepy grin of his. I looked over at the seat next to me, expecting to see the stiff man, but he was gone. The seat was empty. "Where'd he go?" I asked, my voice shaking. The carny didn't answer. He just stared at me, his grin fading into a blank expression. I stood up, my legs trembling, and stumbled out of the ride. My head was spinning and I felt like I was going to puke. I looked around the tent, but there was no sign of the guy who'd been sitting next to me. Without saying another word, I ran out of the tent and back into the main part of the carnival. I found my friends by one of the game stalls and they were laughing and joking like nothing had happened. "Dude, where were you?" one of them asked. "You missed all the fun." I tried to explain what had just happened, but I couldn't get the words out. It sounded crazy, even to me. I ended up just shrugging it off and saying I'd been wandering around. We spent the rest of the night playing games and going on rides, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was really wrong with that ride. The next day I went back to the carnival. I couldn't stop thinking about the final ride and what had happened there. I needed to know if it was all just some elaborate trick or if something more was going on. When I got to the spot where the alley had been, it was gone. The whole area had been cleared out, and there was no sign of the tent or the ride. I asked one of the workers if they knew anything about it, but they just looked at me like I was crazy. "We don't have any ride like that," the guy said. "You sure you were at this carnival?" I've never been a fan of carnivals. Too many weird people and sketchy rides that look like they could fall apart at any second. But when my buddies insisted we check out the traveling carnival that had rolled into town, I couldn't say no. It was one of those places where you feel like anything could happen, and most of it wasn't good. The flashing lights, the loud music, the smell of fried food, it all felt like a bad mix waiting to make someone sick. It was me, my best friend Jake, and two other guys from our group, Tyler and Matt. We've been friends since high school, and we usually stick to normal stuff like grabbing beers or watching games, but for whatever reason, everyone was hyped about this carnival. Jake had heard about a freak show tent that was supposed to be messed up, but in a way that made it impossible to resist checking out. "Man, you're not gonna believe the stuff in there," Jake kept saying, his voice almost too excited. "It's not like the lame stuff you see at other places. This one's legit creepy." I wasn't sold. The idea of paying money to stare at people behind bars or in cages didn't sit right with me. But Jake was right. It was hard to pass up, especially after we saw the line leading into the freak show tent. People were talking about how disturbing it was, and honestly, peer pressure did the rest. We bought tickets and got in line. The outside of the tent was covered in cheap posters of bizarre-looking people like those old-time circus sideshow ads. But instead of fun, it felt wrong. Like these weren't just acts for entertainment. These people looked too real, too uncomfortable. I remember one of the posters showed a man with way too many arms. Another had a guy with skin that looked like scales. It was all fake, of course, but standing there, it got under my skin. When it was finally our turn to go inside, I felt this knot in my stomach. It was just a tent with some stupid displays, I told myself, nothing to freak out about. The inside was dark and the air was heavy with a musty smell. Dim lights hung from the ceiling, barely lighting up the space. As soon as we stepped in, a woman with a freakishly wide smile ushered us to the first display. It started off normal, or as normal as it gets at a place like that. Some of the freaks were clearly just people in makeup or wearing costumes. There was a wolf man covered in hair, a guy with what looked like a split tongue, and someone they called the human pretzel, a dude twisted into some crazy yoga pose. It was all pretty tame, honestly, and I started to relax a little. Maybe Jake had oversold the whole thing. But then we reached the last section of the tent. It was different from the rest. Instead of multiple displays or cages, there was just one man inside a single cage at the back of the tent. The lighting was bad, but you could still see him well enough. He was sitting on the floor, slumped over like he had no energy left. At first glance, I thought he was fake, like some kind of wax figure. But when his eyes slowly moved toward us, I knew he was real. The guy looked terrible. His face was pale, skin stretched too tight over his bones. And he was just staring, not saying anything, not moving, just staring. The worst part was his eyes. They were the kind of eyes that looked straight through you, like he could see right into your head and know every thought you had. The way he stared at me made my skin crawl. I tried to look away, but it felt like his eyes were following me, even when I wasn't looking at him. "Holy crap," Matt whispered. "What's wrong with him?" The guy didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't do anything. He just kept staring. I don't know how long we stood there, but it felt like forever. There was no sign, no name for him, nothing that explained who or what he was supposed to be. That only made it worse. I could hear the other people in the tent moving on to the next display, but none of us could move. Jake, who was usually the loudest guy in the room, was dead quiet. Tyler looked pale. Even Matt, who always made jokes to break tension, didn't say a word. We all just stood there, frozen, staring back at this guy like we were waiting for him to do something, but he didn't. Eventually, one of the workers came up behind us, clearing his throat. "Time to move along, fellas," he said, his voice gruff. He didn't sound like someone working at a carnival, more like a guy who didn't care whether you moved along or not. We left the tent without saying anything. The bright lights and noise of the carnival hit me like a slap in the face. I didn't realize how much tension had built up until we were back outside. But even out there, I couldn't shake the feeling of that guy's eyes on me. Man, that last dude. Tyler started, but his voice trailed off. What the hell was that? I asked, rubbing my arms like I was trying to shake off the cold. He looked, I don't know, sick or something. He looked dead, Jake muttered, like, close to it. We didn't stay at the carnival much longer after that. The mood was shot, and none of us were in the mood to hang out anymore. I tried to forget about the guy in the cage, but the image of his hollow eyes kept creeping back into my mind. That night I couldn't sleep. I just lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. Something about that guy bothered me on a level I didn't understand. I wasn't scared of him exactly, it was more like I felt wrong, like seeing him had messed with my head in some way. The next morning, I woke up to a message from Matt. It was a link to a news article with the subject line, "You need to see this." The headline hit me like a punch to the gut. Missing man found dead weeks after disappearance. I clicked the link and scrolled through the article, my heart pounding in my chest. There, staring back at me from the screen, was the face of the man in the cage. I sat up so fast I almost fell out of bed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. According to the article, the guy had been missing for over 3 weeks. His family had been looking for him and police had been involved. His body had been found near a highway rest stop just outside of town. The freakiest part? He'd been dead the whole time the carnival had been in town. I couldn't wrap my head around it. We had seen him, alive, staring right at us in that cage. But the article was clear. He'd been dead for weeks. There was no mistaking it. The face in the photo was the same face that had stared at us the night before. I called Jake, not sure what to even say. He picked up on the first ring and I didn't have to explain anything. He already knew. "You saw it too, right?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Yeah, I don't get it, man. How is that possible? I don't know. But I'm telling you, that was the same guy, I swear it." We spent the rest of the day talking about it, trying to make sense of what we had seen. The more we talked, the more unsettled I felt. There were no answers, no explanation, just the memory of that man sitting in a cage staring at us with dead, hollow eyes. My friend Tom, he's the adventurous type, the kind of guy who drags you along to try things you'd never think to do on your own. So, when a traveling carnival came to our town, he was all in. He talked about the rides, the games, and especially the House of Freaks. I wasn't too keen on the idea, but he was persistent. "Come on, man, it'll be fun." "How many chances do you get to see a place like this?" he said. Reluctantly, I agreed, and that's how we ended up there on a Friday night. The carnival was crowded, full of families, teenagers, and couples, all milling about with bright lights flashing around them. The smells of fried food filled the air, and somewhere nearby I could hear the constant dinging of game booths and people cheering. It was the usual carnival stuff, except for one tent at the far end. That's where the House of Freaks was. The tent was a bit smaller than I expected, tucked away from the main attractions. A faded, old-fashioned sign stood out front, its lettering peeling off. "Come witness the strange, the bizarre, the horrifying," it said in big red letters. The whole thing had a creepy, run-down look to it, like it had been part of the carnival for way too long. "See? This is gonna be awesome," Tom said, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. I wasn't convinced, but he dragged me toward the entrance where an old man stood next to the door. He looked like something out of an old-timey carnival, with his bowler hat, worn-out suit, and a wide grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "2 tickets, Tom said, handing over some cash. The old man tipped his hat and handed us 2 paper stubs before gesturing us inside. "Enjoy the show, gentlemen," he said, his voice gravelly and low. Something about the way he spoke sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off. It was probably just part of the act. Inside, the tent was dimly lit, and the air felt thick, almost stuffy. The first room was lined with glass cases, each one displaying some odd figure inside. There were wax models, or at least I thought they were, of people with strange deformities. Some were exaggerated, like a man with 3 arms or a woman with 2 heads. Others were more subtle but still unsettling, like a guy whose face was twisted in a permanent scream. I knew these things were just made to scare people, but the details were so lifelike that I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We moved slowly from one display to the next. I could hear other people in the tent, their low murmurs of discomfort, but it was mostly quiet. The further we went, the weirder the exhibits got. One of them had what looked like a man with a snake's body instead of legs, coiled up inside a small, cramped glass box. Another showed a girl with no eyes, just dark, hollow sockets staring back at us. Every time I looked closer, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "This is insane," Tom whispered, but he sounded more excited than scared. I wasn't so sure. The whole place was giving me a bad feeling, but I didn't want to be the one to chicken out, so I kept quiet. We reached the final exhibit, tucked in the back of the tent. It was just a wooden box about waist-high with a sign on it that read, "Do not open." Tom immediately got that mischievous look in his eyes. "Well, that's just asking for trouble," he said with a laugh. "Don't do it, man. It's probably some dumb jump scare or something," I warned him, but I knew he wasn't going to listen. He never did. Without hesitating, he flipped open the lid. We both leaned in, expecting to see something inside, but it was completely empty. There was nothing there, just a plain wooden box with no bottom, no hidden compartments, nothing. Tom laughed it off, calling it a lame trick, but I wasn't so sure. Something about the box being empty felt wrong, like we were missing something important. And then, the lights went out. It was sudden and absolute. One moment we were standing there, staring into the empty box, and the next, we were plunged into darkness. I couldn't see a thing, not even my hand in front of my face. I could hear Tom shifting beside me, but neither of us said anything for a second. Then I heard it. Breathing. It wasn't either of us. Slow, deep breaths, like someone standing just inches away. "Tom," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I hear it too," he replied, his voice shaking just a little. Before we could react, the lights flickered back on, dim and shaky. My heart was pounding, and I glanced around trying to figure out where the breathing had come from. That's when I saw him, the old man, the barker from the front of the tent standing right behind us. His grin was wider now, too wide, and his eyes were off. There was something unnatural about the way he was smiling. It didn't look right, like his face wasn't made to hold that expression. "Enjoying the show?" he asked, his voice just as gravelly as before, but now there was a strange, unsettling edge to it. Tom didn't say anything. Neither did I. We both just stood there, frozen in place. The old man tilted his head, his grin never faltering, and for a moment, I thought he was going to reach out and grab one of us. My body was screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't move. It was like I was stuck in place, trapped by his gaze. Then, without warning, Tom bolted. He grabbed my arm, pulling me out of my trance, and we ran. We didn't stop to look back, didn't say anything, we just ran as fast as we could, crashing through the exit of the tent and into the open air. We didn't stop running until we were halfway across the carnival grounds. Both of us were panting, out of breath, and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. It wasn't until we were far enough away that I finally looked back, half expecting to see the old man following us. But there was nothing. The House of Freaks tent stood silently in the distance, looking as innocent as ever, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something worse. Tom tried to laugh it off. "Man, that was something, huh?" he said between gasps for breath, but I could tell he was shaken, even if he wouldn't admit it. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind kept going back to the box, to the breathing, and especially to that old man. There was something wrong with him, something deeply unsettling that I couldn't explain. And then there was the box, empty, but still wrong. We left the carnival not long after that, both of us too rattled to stick around. We didn't talk about what happened much, not even the next day. Tom acted like it was no big deal, just another carnival trick. But I knew he felt it too. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the old man's grin, wide and unnatural, like a mask that didn't fit.